Hey, wait a second. Hey, boy, aren't we supposed to be looking for... Oh! What the...
What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect. In this video, I'm going to be sharing the 3D scene and compositing walkthrough of the animation we recently uploaded on this channel where we recreated one of the shots from the new Top Gun movie trailer. As usual, this 3D walkthrough is not really a tutorial, but we'll go through a lot of the concepts we used to create the scene. I will be doing a full tutorial on the vapor trails in the future, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. This is our scene setup here, and as you can see here, we have our 3 jets in our scene, and they're just kind of animated through 3D space here. And this is actually a very simple scene to create. The most difficult part of this shot was simply creating that simulation for the vapor trails, which is why I'll do a more in-depth breakdown for that specific element. But the first thing we did to create this shot was just import the 3D jet here and then duplicate it. So we had 3 jets in the scene. And then I proceeded to animate all 3 of the jets. And the animation of these jets was actually fairly simple as well. What I did at first, before animating the jets from right to left on the x-axis here, is I just animated some basic rotation. So as you can see here, if I just go to the middle of our scene, and I'm going to turn off some of these constraints here to show you what I mean. So you can see that at first I've just animated the rotation of the jets over time. I didn't actually animate the jets on the x-axis at all. That's just because I wanted to focus on the rotation first and then dial in the movement a bit later when we did the simulation. After animating these 2 jets, I then added a camera to our scene here. And I'll just view through the camera here for a second. And then I also animated the camera kind of rotating around the jets over the course of the timeline. So pretty simple process at first here, and to give a little bit more of an immersive feel, I've actually added some expressions on the camera move here to give it a little bit of a handheld look. So you can see in the graph editor, if I select the camera and then go to the graph editor, you can see that if we select the rotation of our camera here, we have some noise modifiers, and what that's going to do is it's going to add some noise to the rotation of the camera on the X, the Y, and the Z axis. And I actually have a tutorial on how you can do this. I'll put a link to that in the description below, but it's a nice way to add a little bit more of an immersive feel to your shot once you have animated the keyframes of your camera over the course of your timeline. Of course, it depends on the look you're trying to go for, but I thought it was suitable for this project. So after animating the camera, and once I was satisfied with the basic rotation of our jets over the course of our timeline, I then wanted to animate both the camera and the 2 main jets in our scene on the x-axis as well, so they would fly throughout space. And to do that, all I've done is use a child of constraint attached to an animated empty. So as you can see here, if I zoom out a bit and go further back in our x-axis here, you can see I've added an empty to our scene. And over the course of the timeline, I've animated this empty on the x-axis. And by using the child of constraint, I've parented our main 2 jets along with our camera to this empty. So you can see, let's just scroll a little bit further into our scene here. You can see that if I select one of our jets here and enable this constraint, it actually now is being animated with this empty here, which is how we rendered the final scene. So I'll do the same thing here with the 2nd jet, and I've also enabled the child of constraint on this 3rd jet as well. So actually you can see if I disable the child of constraint on all 3 of these, you can see the kind of static version of the animation as the jet flies through. And the scene could have worked out without actually animating the jets on the x-axis, but since we had particle systems in play, we actually needed there to be movement along that axis as well in order to get the particles to act correctly. So I've applied these child of constraints to pretty much our entire scene here, including the camera itself. So you can see when I select the camera here and apply this constraint, it stays with the jets over the course of their movement over the x-axis. So this is the way I animated this scene. Pretty simple animation, just on the x-axis and then the rotation of the jets as well. And then of course I had to refine when the jets turned off after the 3rd jet kind of goes in between them. So anyways, I'll go ahead and enable this child of constraint here and continue this process. The next thing I did once I was satisfied with the animation was start lighting and adding an environment to our scene. Now the environment for the scene is very simple. I just used a basic HDRI from HDRI Hub, and you can see it here in the world settings. And if I just zoom in to one of our jets here and go to rendered view, and then under the render properties tab, I'll turn the transparent option off. You can see that we just have this basic HDRI that's adding a nice background and environment for our jet. So as our camera moves through space, the environment moves as well. And even though this HDRI is only really moving with the rotation of our camera, since our jets are so high up, the parallax that would be there is very minimal, so we can actually get away with just using an HDRI for this kind of effect versus creating a reprojection or a CG environment by itself. So this is a super simple way you can create some jet flyover shots. Another thing I've done to light these jets realistically in accordance with our HDRI, you can see kind of in the background here how the mountains are being lit kind of from the left side here. You can see that, you know, if we look closely, that the sun is kind of coming from the left, and you can actually see exactly where the sun is off in this direction. But I wanted there to actually be a little bit more harsh lighting on the jets themselves. So all I've done to kind of accent the way the jets are being lit and to match them to our HDRI environmental background is I've just added this basic sun lamp here, which as you can see is lighting our jets from a similar direction as the mountains are being lit in the background. So that is how I lit the jets. Very simple setup, just an HDRI plus a sun lamp to accent the jets and give them a little bit more shape. So after animating the jets and creating the basic environment and lighting, I added a few particle systems to bring the jets into the scene a bit better. The first particle system I added was for the middle jet here that flies through the middle of our other two jets. And you can see if I just select our missiles here and go to our particle system tab, you can see I have a particle system here, and I'll go ahead and enable it. And I'll go ahead and go to this view layer as well. And what I've done here is I've attached a basic particle system to either side of our wing here to create some basic contrails. So you can see that if I go to rendered view, you can see what we're getting here. And all I've done is created a basic particle system on each edge of our wing. And then I've instanced a volumetric icosphere that is very small on each of the particles in the particle system. Now it might not look like contrails right now because it's very sharp, but you'll see that once we composite this view layer on top of everything, we add some blur to it, and it actually works pretty nicely to create kind of a contrail effect. And using particle systems like this is one way you can create these kind of volumetric effects without actually simulating something, which can often take a lot of time. So sometimes you need to simulate something to make it more realistic if it's a really close shot. For example, a little bit later in this scene, we have the actual jet vapor contrails, which we actually simulate. But in this case, for the contrails, we just used a basic particle system and instanced a volumetric contrails particle with a simple volumetric shader on it. And I actually have a tutorial on this effect as well, so I'll put a link to that in the description below. In addition to these contrail particles, I've also added some heat distortion particles. So you can see here if I go to the heat distortion layer, and I'm just going to turn off our contrail particles for now, but you can see if I select our afterburner here, you can see that I've added another particle system to the middle jet. And if I turn this guy on, we're doing kind of the same thing as that last particle system, except in this case, rather than rendering the actual volumetric data from that particle system, we're actually going to use the render data to drive a displace modifier in the compositor. So I'll get to that in a second when we go through the compositing breakdown, but essentially we can render out this image data and use the white portions of the image data to create kind of a heat distortion effect over our entire image. So we're not actually overlaying this on our scene, but we're using this to drive a heat displacement effect. So that's one way you can also use particles. And I also have a tutorial on how you can do this heat displacement effect as well. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. But anyways, after creating this particle system and adding it to its own view layer, it was time to create our final particle system and actually create a simulation in mantaflow to create those air vapor trail effects when the jets make that sharp turn off at the end of our scene. So I'll go ahead and turn this particle system off and go to our jet vapor view layer. And if I select the main body of our F-18 here, you can see that we have another particle system on this. And in this scenario, let's go ahead and view from our camera here. starting on frame 178, we have these very short-lived particles being emitted on our jet fuselage here. And we're using these particles as fuel for our mantaflow simulation. So I wanted them to be very specific on the front portion of our fuselage here. So in order to do that, I've actually weight painted where I wanted the particles to emit from using a vertex group. So you can see if I go to weight paint here, you can see I've actually weight painted where I want the particles to be emitted from. And then in our particle system settings, I've selected that vertex group to be where the particles are most dense. So if I just added this particle system to the entire fuselage, the particles would be more uniform kind of in the back here as well. But since I want them mostly just, right at the start of our wing here, I weight painted that data in that specific area. And I've done the same thing here on the other jet, just kind of playing around with the timing in which the particles are being released. And once we actually created the particle system, then we went to the modifiers tab and added the particles as a fluid flow object that would drive the smoke vapor simulation in mantaflow. And as you guys probably know, in order to create a successful smoke simulation inside of Blender, you need at least two things. You need something to be a flow object, which is our particles here, where our smoke is being emitted from. And then you also need a domain, which tells Blender the kind of area that you want to simulate within. So I then added two different domain cubes here. You can see that these two boxes here are the areas in which I am simulating our vapor trails. And I've cranked up the resolution divisions quite a bit, all the way up to 512, which is pretty high. However, I didn't use any high resolution noise because, we added so much blur to it. But since the jets kind of go fairly quickly through our scene here, we needed to have a pretty big domain cube. And the bigger you make your domain cube, the more resolution divisions you're often going to need because you need to compensate for all that space. So I've cranked up the resolution divisions to 512 and then simulated each of these vapor effects. And you can see if I just turn them on really quick. And now you can see kind of what our simulation is looking like in our viewport mode anyway. And for both of these vapor trails, I've adjusted the smoke domain parameters so that the vapor would dissolve very quickly and give us that look of a very quick evaporating vapor. So this is the effect in viewport mode. You can see that I've enabled the jets as a holdout, which will help us composite them into our scene. And yeah, that was essentially our final simulation before we got into the compositing process. And then of course, as I've shown in previous videos, I've added each of our different elements to their own specific view layer and made the elements that we don't need to see in that view layer either a holdout or an indirect only, so that it would just affect the lighting of the element that we do want to see on that view layer. So anyways, let's get into the compositing process next. Alright guys, so here we are inside of our compositing project file here, and this is our node tree for the project. Fairly simple process here. One thing I should mention before we get into this is I've rendered out all of our view layers on a multi-layer OpenEXR file so that all of our passes could be accessed in one file. So I have a video on that as well, but OpenEXR is generally the way to go when you're trying to export to a compositing software with multiple layers or multiple passes within those layers. So pretty simple compositing setup here. I didn't even export multiple passes. I just exported, the jet beauty pass, the vapor, the contrails, and the heat distortion particles on their own separate view layers. And then of course the environment background as well. So let's go ahead and get into this here. The first thing that we've added to our composite was our environment. So you can see I'll just add a viewer HDRI background rendered out by itself. So, we've added a little bit of blur to it to kind of give it a little bit more depth. Not too much, since we're shooting on a pretty wide angle lens. It wouldn't make sense to give it too much, blur, but just a little bit to take the edge off. And then I've also just brightened up that background a bit with an RGB curves here, which you can see right here. And then I've used this alpha over node to overlay our first jet. So I've rendered out each jet on their own separate view layer. So this is just our jet far, so the jet that's furthest off in the distance. So you can see when we overlay this, we get just our background jet. And then I've also, I actually did export an ambient occlusion pass. I should have mentioned that. So we have a combined beauty pass as well as an ambient occlusion pass, which I use to add those little smaller detailed shadows on the jet itself. And then I've kind of brightened up the overall look of the jet to match our environment a bit better. So yeah, after I've added this far jet, I then added our jet middle contrails. So I'm kind of just layering things onto each other just like you would in, you know, another compositing software such as After Effects. Nuke is a little bit different, obviously, since you have that 3D workflow. You can put things on cards and such. I guess in After Effects you can do that too, but yeah, won't get too much into that, but just kind of overlaying these elements on top of each other. And this is our middle jet contrails. I want to get to a part of our image where we actually see the contrails themselves here. So here on frame 168, you can sort of see the contrail effect here. It's pretty subtle. So let me go ahead and just isolate this for you guys so you can see what we're adding. So here are our contrails with some motion blur on there, as you can see. But then we've added some blur as well as an RGB curves effect to brighten it up. So you can see once we add the blur to it, it's just pretty much, you know, it's so blurred that you can't tell that those are particle systems, and it's such a subtle effect, but you can see it in the final result, just kind of a translucent overlay. So you can kind of see it here. Once we overlay it on our jet, you can just see it's just barely there. Let me just turn it off really quick, turn it to 0. You can see it disappears now. So this is what it looks like without that, and then obviously there's some movement in the particle system as well, which helps sell it a bit as well. So anyways, we added these contrails, and then of course we added the middle jet next. So we have this view layer going into a multiply node, adding some ambient occlusion to it, and then, you know, adding a little RGB curves to brighten up the element a bit, and then giving it a little bit of blur as well on the y-axis to kind of accent the motion blur that's already in the shot. So we can just show this by itself here. So here we have our jet by itself, and then our output from our alpha over node once we overlay it right here. And next we've added our third jet here in the foreground, and just done the same thing here, guys. Just added a little bit of ambient occlusion with our multiply node, brightened it up with an RGB curves, and then used our alpha over node to overlay it on top of our final composite, just like this. And then finally, we added our jet vapor effect. So you can see this isolated by itself here, which I think looks pretty cool when you have the jets as a holdout. Let's see here, we got to go a little bit further in our scene. You can see it here at frame 180. Having the jet enabled as a holdout on this layer helps kind of integrate the vapor into the scene quite a bit better. And then you can see here, when we actually overlay it on top of our composite, how it's integrated here. So let's go ahead and show this. You can see the jet vapor integrated into the scene, and you can see I've added a little bit of blur and some RGB curves to brighten up that vapor a little bit. And then I actually didn't mention for our actual 3D process, we added some cloud volumetrics as well. So that's what this view layer is here, and it's pretty subtle, but I'll show you guys this one as well. So this is some cloud volumetrics that we have passing from left to right. Just add a little bit more movement to our scene, and then I've just blurred it, add a little bit of RGB curves to blend it into our shot a bit. And finally, we've added our heat distortion particle systems. Actually, let me just show you guys the final result of those clouds. Although it's pretty subtle, I'm not sure you're even gonna notice. You can sort of tell once you see the final render that there's some atmosphere falling in front of the camera, which is what those clouds are doing. But yeah, it's pretty subtle in this still frame here. But anyways, finally the next step before we added our color correction and a little bit of lens distortion was adding that heat distortion from that particle system that I mentioned. So you can see if I bring our viewer node over to this view layer where we have our heat distortion particle system, you can see that this is the particle system that we created. It's actually going to drive our heat distortion. So obviously these are moving throughout 3D space, but all we're doing is using the white portion as data to drive this displace node right here. And again, I have a tutorial on that, so I'll put a link in the description. But very simple way to add some heat distortion. So I've just blurred it a bit, added a little bit of RGB curves, and created this type of input for our displace node here. Now you can see once we add this on top of our final composite, we get something like this. Now if you zoom in, you can see the distortion here that's being applied through that displace node. So just a nice little way to add an extra touch to your shot. And I know that in the actual trailer, when you see this shot, there's actually heat distortion going on as well. And I assume they did that in a similar way in their composites. Now, obviously, our jets aren't as detailed as theirs. But yeah, finally, after adding all those view layers and effects on top of our jets, we've added a little bit of lens distortion here, in addition to some glare with our glare node. And after adding that distortion, I finished off with adding a simple color grade inside of our editing software and got our final result. Anyways guys, that is it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to see next on the channel. Subscribe if you're interested in more visual effects content, and I'll see you next time.